For the murders of your wife and your 2 daughters, this court has weighed the evidence and the jury's recommendation. It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to death.
You can't do this! You signed that paper, and you're a dead man, you hear me?
Remove this man from my courtroom!
Now!
On April 3, 2023, in San Diego, California, Hollywood producer Kevin Keith murdered his wife, Sophia Keith, and their 2 young daughters, Lily, age 5, and Harper, age 2, in their oceanfront mansion. The horrific triple homicide sent shockwaves through the normally serene coastal community, where multi-million-dollar homes with panoramic ocean views typically shield residents from the darker realities of life. Sophia, a successful commercial director in her own right, was found zip-tied and strangled in the master bedroom of their 8,500-square-foot estate, while each of their daughters was killed using different methods in separate parts of the home. The calculated nature of the killings, with evidence of premeditation and distinct methods for each victim, immediately raised red flags for investigators about the intimate and personal nature of the crimes. Before we dive deeper into this harrowing case, I'd love to ask you to subscribe if you're enjoying this true crime analysis, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. And now, let's return to the devastating events that unfolded in that San Diego mansion. The bodies were discovered by the family's nanny, Maria Gonzalez, who arrived at 7:15 a.m. to care for the children, only to find a scene of unimaginable horror that would haunt her for the rest of her life. According to the initial police report, Sophia's body showed signs of a struggle, with defensive wounds on her hands and arms, suggesting she had fought desperately for her life before being subdued with zip ties and ultimately strangled. 5-year-old Lily was found in the hallway with multiple stab wounds, a trail of blood indicating she had attempted to run from her attacker. Her small body collapsed just feet from the staircase in what appeared to be a desperate bid to escape. 2-year-old Harper, the youngest victim, was discovered in her pink princess-themed bedroom, her tiny wrists bound with zip ties, a plastic bag used to suffocate her still partially covering her face, her favorite stuffed elephant clutched in her stiffened fingers. The Keith home, a modernist masterpiece featured in architectural magazines and celebrity home tours, became transformed overnight from a symbol of success and family prosperity to a scene of unimaginable cruelty. Floor-to-ceiling windows that once showcased the Pacific Ocean's sparkling blue waters now reflected the red and blue lights of police vehicles as investigators worked meticulously to process the crime scene. Neighbors gathered behind yellow police tape, expressions of shock and disbelief on their faces as they struggled to comprehend how such violence could erupt in their exclusive enclave. The family's reputation in the community had been sterling. Kevin was known as a charming, if somewhat reserved, entertainment executive who had produced several successful streaming series, while Sophia was regarded as warm and unpretentious, despite her growing acclaim for directing award-winning commercials for major brands. Initial media coverage focused on the possibility of a home invasion gone horribly wrong, as the neighborhood had experienced a recent string of high-end burglaries. Yet detectives noted several troubling inconsistencies from the outset. No signs of forced entry at any access point to the house. The sophisticated security system had been deactivated from inside, and none of the valuable artwork, electronics, or jewelry appeared to be missing. The family's 2 luxury vehicles remained in the garage, and Sophia's designer handbag with cash and credit cards sat untouched on the kitchen counter. San Diego Police Department homicide detective Mason Davis, a 15-year veteran with a reputation for methodical investigation, remarked in his preliminary notes that the scene lacked the chaos and disarray typical of home invasions, instead showing signs of a controlled, deliberate series of attacks. These observations, combined with the different methods used to kill each victim, suggested a deeply personal motive rather than a random act of violence by an outside intruder. Kevin Keith was noticeably absent when the bodies were discovered, his whereabouts initially unknown until he arrived at the scene approximately 2 hours after police, claiming to have been at an early breakfast meeting with investors in downtown San Diego. His demeanor upon arrival became the subject of conflicting accounts. The first responding officers noted his apparent shock and emotional breakdown, falling to his knees on the mansion's marble driveway when informed of the deaths. Yet Maria Gonzalez, the nanny who had worked for the family for 3 years, later told investigators she was disturbed by something off about his reaction, describing it as like watching someone try to act sad in a movie. This initial discrepancy in the perception of Kevin's grief would later take on new significance as investigators began to piece together the events leading up to that bloody April morning in San Diego. The sunny Southern California setting, with its palm trees swaying in the gentle ocean breeze, provided an eerily beautiful backdrop to one of the most horrific family annihilation cases in the city's history. Kevin Keith maintained his composure during his initial interview with detectives, presenting himself as a devastated husband and father whose world had been shattered beyond repair. He sat in the sterile interview room at the San Diego Police Department headquarters, his designer suit wrinkled, claiming to have no idea who would want to harm his perfect family. His timeline for the previous evening seemed airtight at first glance. He described working late at his home office until around 11 p.m., checking on his sleeping daughters before joining his wife in bed, then waking early for his 6 a.m. breakfast meeting with potential investors for his newest production. He specifically mentioned that Sophia had been alive and sleeping when he left the house at 5:30 a.m., even noting that he had kissed her forehead before departing. The confidence with which he delivered these details, making direct eye contact with detectives and offering specific sensory memories like the scent of Sophia's shampoo and the sound of Harper's gentle snoring from the baby monitor, initially gave his account an air of authenticity that would require concrete evidence to disprove. As the sun set on that first day of investigation, the sprawling Keith mansion was illuminated by powerful crime scene lights that cast long shadows across the manicured lawn. Forensic technicians in white protective suits moved methodically from room to room, documenting, photographing, and collecting evidence that would eventually tell a very different story than the one Kevin Keith had presented to police. Blood spatter analysis would later reveal crucial information about the sequence of the killings, the positioning of the attacker, and the defensive movements of the victims, particularly 5-year-old Lily, whose desperate attempt to escape had left a tragic trail of evidence. The Pacific Ocean crashed against the cliffs below the property, its rhythmic sounds a stark contrast to the grim silence that had fallen over the home. Inside, among the tasteful decor and family photographs showing smiling faces on beaches and at Disneyland, lay the remnants of lives cut brutally short, and the first pieces of a puzzle that would ultimately expose the dark truth behind the gleaming facade of the Keith family. Sophia Keith, at 32 years old, had established herself as one of the most promising commercial directors in the industry, known for her innovative visual style and ability to elicit authentic performances even in brief advertising spots. Her career had begun behind the scenes as a production assistant on independent films, where her keen eye for composition and natural leadership qualities quickly distinguished her from her peers. Colleagues described her as both technically brilliant and genuinely kind, a rare combination in the often cutthroat entertainment industry, with a particular talent for creating a collaborative atmosphere on set that brought out the best in everyone, from A-list celebrities to child actors. Her recent campaign for a major automotive company had won several industry awards, with critics praising her ability to infuse emotional authenticity into what could have been standard commercial fare, and she had just signed a contract to direct her first feature film in the coming year, a dream she had been working toward since film school. Beyond her professional accomplishments, Sophia was remembered by friends as a devoted mother who had managed the delicate balance of a demanding career and family life with remarkable grace. Her Instagram account, now a digital memorial, showcased not only behind-the-scenes moments from her commercial shoots, but also tender glimpses of family life. 5-year-old Lily painting at an easel, 2-year-old Harper taking wobbly first steps on the beach, the girls in matching pajamas during Christmas morning. She never bought into the Hollywood obsession with appearances, recalled her longtime friend and assistant director Melissa Chen at the memorial service held 2 weeks after the murders. She'd show up to high-level meetings with studio executives with Harper's baby food stains on her blouse and joke about it, completely secure in who she was both as a director and as a mom. This authenticity had endeared her to colleagues throughout the industry, many of whom traveled to San Diego to attend the memorial service that filled the Seaside Chapel to capacity, with hundreds more gathering outside to pay their respects. Lily Keith, at 5 years old, had inherited her mother's artistic sensibility and her father's confidence, a kindergartner who had already developed a distinctive personality that charmed teachers and classmates alike. Her kindergarten teacher, Elaine Dominguez, described her as intellectually curious but also deeply empathetic, noting how Lily would often be the first to comfort classmates who were upset or help newcomers feel welcome. Her artwork, proudly displayed in the family home, showed unusual composition and color choices for a child her age, with her mother often joking that Lily would surpass her artistic abilities by middle school. In her short life, Lily had developed passions for marine biology after visits to the nearby Scripps Aquarium, ballet classes that she attended twice weekly, and creating elaborate stories for her collection of stuffed animals, complete with distinct voices and personalities for each character. The investigation would later reveal the heartbreaking detail that Lily had been working on a special handmade Mother's Day card in the weeks before her death, discovered hidden in her craft drawer, covered with colorful hand-drawn hearts, and the carefully printed words, "To the best mommy in the universe." 2-year-old Harper, the youngest victim, was described by family friends as the sunshine of the household, a toddler with infectious laughter and boundless energy who had recently begun stringing together simple sentences. Nanny Maria Gonzalez, who spent the most time with Harper during Sophia's shooting days, recalled her as fearless and joyful, a child who approached every new experience with enthusiasm, whether tasting a new food, meeting a stranger, or attempting to keep up with her older sister. Harper's pediatrician noted at her 2-year checkup, just 3 weeks before her death, that she was developmentally advanced in several areas, particularly verbal skills and social interaction. Home videos found during the investigation showed Harper twirling in the sprinklers of the mansion's garden, singing along with remarkable clarity to the soundtrack of her favorite animated film and reading picture books to her stuffed elephant, making up stories based on the illustrations with creative abandon. These glimpses into her personality only deepened the tragedy of her life being cut short before she had the chance to develop into the person she might have become. The Keith family had cultivated an image of aspirational success, beautiful and talented parents raising 2 equally gifted daughters in a stunning oceanfront home. But friends insisted the warmth and connection between them was genuine, not merely for public consumption. Sunday brunches on their terrace overlooking the Pacific were a regular tradition, with an open invitation to friends who remembered lively conversations, Sophia's excellent cooking, and Kevin appearing every bit the devoted father, teaching Lily to swim in their infinity pool or patiently building block towers with Harper. Jessica Wong, A producer who had worked with both Keevan and Sophia on several projects recalled at the memorial service how Keevan had often spoken proudly of Sophia's talents, seemingly supportive of her rising star, even as his own career faced challenges. What makes this so incomprehensible is that they really seemed like the family who had figured it all out: successful careers, beautiful children, and a genuine partnership, Wong told reporters, her voice breaking. Or at least that's what we all believed. As investigators delved deeper into the victims' lives, they discovered a more complex reality beneath the polished surface that the family presented to the world. Sophia's close friends revealed that while she maintained a positive public persona, she had privately expressed concerns about Keevan's increasingly controlling behavior in the months leading up to her death. Text messages recovered from her phone showed conversations with her sister in New York, discussing Keevan's strange mood swings and obsessive checking of her schedule and communications. Her sister urged her to consider couples therapy, to which Sophia replied, "He'd never agree to it. You know how he is about appearances." Perhaps most tellingly, Sophia had scheduled a consultation with a family law attorney for April 10, 2023, a week after she was killed, though it remains unclear whether she was considering divorce or simply seeking legal advice regarding financial matters she had discovered. The investigation revealed that despite their public image as the perfect couple, Keevan and Sophia had been sleeping in separate bedrooms for at least 2 months before the murders, a fact confirmed by the household staff. Friends who had visited the home recently noted increased tension between the couple, though both Keevan and Sophia had maintained a united front at industry events. Sophia's mother, Eleanor Taylor, told investigators that during her last phone call with her daughter, just 2 days before the murders, Sophia had mentioned finding disturbing financial documents in Keevan's home office, but had been interrupted when Keevan unexpectedly returned home, promising to call back later, a call that never came. These glimpses into the private struggles of the family added layers of complexity to the case, suggesting that the idyllic life portrayed on social media and at industry functions concealed growing discord and potentially threatening discoveries. The San Diego community, particularly the exclusive La Jolla neighborhood where the family resided, reacted to the murders with a combination of horror, grief, and the uncomfortable realization that such violence could occur in their seemingly perfect enclave. Lily's kindergarten class at the prestigious La Jolla Country Day School held a memorial butterfly release, each child sharing a memory of their friend, before watching the monarchs take flight toward the ocean. The preschool that Harper attended planted a flowering plumeria tree in her honor, with a small plaque bearing her name and favorite quote from her beloved storybooks. Adventures everywhere. Local parents, confronted with explaining the inexplicable to their own children, struggled to preserve their sense of safety while honoring the memory of the 2 young victims who had played alongside their kids at community parks and birthday parties. The deaths of Sophia, Lily, and Harper represented not just the loss of 3 individual lives, but the destruction of a family that had, at least outwardly, embodied the California dream of success, beauty, and boundless potential. In the aftermath of their deaths, a more complete picture of Sophia Keith emerged through interviews with colleagues and friends, revealing a woman who had been navigating increasingly troubled waters with remarkable strength. Her career trajectory had been impressive, but hard-won, requiring her to overcome the industry's gender biases while balancing the demands of motherhood. Sophia never wanted to be defined solely as a female director or a mom who directed. She just wanted to be recognized for her work, said David Levinson, an executive producer who had collaborated with her on several major campaigns. Her determination had recently led to her investigating financial irregularities she had discovered in production accounts connected to her husband's company, a professional diligence that may have ultimately cost her her life. Several friends recounted conversations in which Sophia had expressed concern about inconsistencies in Kevyn's business dealings, but had been hesitant to confront him directly until she had gathered more information, aware of his fragile ego and quick temper when questioned about his professional judgment. The loss of potential represented by the murders extended beyond the immediate family to the communities they had enriched through their presence. Sophia had been a mentor to young female directors, volunteering time to review portfolios and offer guidance to women trying to break into the male-dominated field. Lily, despite her young age, had shown promise not only in art, but in mathematics, her kindergarten teacher noting that she had already been working at a second-grade level in her numerical skills. Even Tiny Harper had demonstrated unusual musical aptitude, able to remember and repeat complex melodies after hearing them just once. The triple homicide had extinguished these developing talents, along with the countless potential contributions the three might have made in their lifetimes. As Detective Mason Davis remarked during a press conference 3 days after the murders, when someone kills a mother and her children, they don't just end those individual lives. They erase entire future generations and all they might have brought to our world. The 911 call came in at 7:22 a.m. on April 3, 2023. Maria Gonzalez's voice nearly unintelligible through her hysterical sobs as she attempted to explain the scene she had discovered upon arriving for work. "They're all dead. Oh my God, the children. They're dead," she repeated, gasping for breath, as the dispatcher tried to elicit more specific information about the location and situation. The recording, later played during the trial, captured the raw horror of that first discovery. The moment when an ordinary workday transformed into a nightmare as Maria entered through her usual side entrance, calling out a cheerful greeting that went unanswered in the unnaturally silent house. Maria described to the dispatcher finding Sophia first, seeing her employer's body on the master bedroom floor, then frantically searching for the children, hoping against hope that they might somehow have been spared, only to discover the brutal reality in Lily's case, and then the even more horrific scene in Harper's bedroom. First responders arrived at the Keith residence at 7:29 a.m., the paramedics quickly confirming what Maria already knew. All three victims had been dead for several hours, their bodies showing signs of rigor mortis and lividity consistent with deaths occurring in the early morning hours. Officer James Wilson, first on the scene, immediately recognized the need for homicide detectives and forensic specialists, securing the perimeter of the property and beginning the process of documenting everyone who entered or exited the crime scene. The level of violence was extreme, particularly considering the ages of two of the victims, Officer Wilson noted in his initial report, describing the controlled and methodical nature of the killings that suggested significant premeditation rather than a crime of passion. The preliminary assessment by responding officers immediately categorized the case as a high priority, with San Diego Police Department mobilizing their most experienced investigators, including Detective Mason Davis, who arrived on scene by 8:15 a.m. and took charge of the rapidly expanding investigation. The San Diego medical examiner, Dr. Vanessa Chen, conducted her preliminary examination at the scene, establishing an estimated time of death between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. for all three victims based on body temperature, lividity patterns, and other physical indicators. Her initial observations, meticulously documented with photographs and dictated notes, revealed crucial details about the methods and sequence of the killings. Sophia Keith showed signs of having been subdued first with the zip ties found still binding her wrists behind her back, followed by manual strangulation that left distinctive bruising on her neck consistent with adult male hands. Lily's multiple stab wounds, 17 in total, indicated a frenzied attack with a kitchen knife found discarded in the hallway. The blood spatter analysis suggesting she had been running away when the attack began. Harper's death appeared to be the most calculated, with the toddler's tiny wrists bound with zip ties identical to those used on her mother before a plastic garbage bag was placed over her head and secured with another zip tie around her neck, causing asphyxiation. The critical breakthrough in the investigation came when Detective Davis, following standard procedure, requested security camera footage from businesses within a 5-mile radius of the Keith home. Among the dozens of recordings collected was footage from a 24-hour hardware store located approximately 3 miles from the residence, showing Kevin Keith entering the store at 2:07 a.m. on April 3rd. The night manager, Trevor Winters, immediately recognized Kevin as the customer who had purchased zip ties, a box of heavy-duty black garbage bags, bleach, and a pair of work gloves in a cash transaction that had struck him as unusual, given both the time and the combination of items. The security footage clearly showed Kevin dressed in dark clothing with a baseball cap pulled low but his face still identifiable, selecting the items with deliberate care and paying with cash rather than the credit card he first produced before appearing to reconsider. He seemed totally normal, not agitated or anything, Winters later testified, but something felt off about buying that specific combination of things in the middle of the night, which is why I remembered him when the detectives showed me his picture. This discovery of the security footage directly contradicted Kevin Keith's statement to police that he had been home in bed between 11:00 p.m. and 5:30 a.m., creating the first major crack in his alibi and establishing a timeline that aligned perfectly with the medical examiner's estimated time of death. Forensic analysis of the zip ties recovered from Sophia and Harper's bodies would later confirm they were from the same manufacturer and lot number as those sold at the hardware store, while the plastic bag used to suffocate Harper matched the distinctive logo and thickness of the garbage bags purchased that night. The store receipt, retrieved from the register records, showed the exact time of purchase, 2:13 a.m., and itemized the products that would later be identified as the murder implements. This concrete piece of evidence, capturing the suspect purchasing the tools he would use to kill his family less than an hour later, became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, what Detective Davis would later describe as the kind of evidence that leaves no room for reasonable doubt. As forensic technicians processed the crime scene throughout that first day, they discovered several attempts to clean up evidence, including bleach-soaked towels hidden in the laundry room hamper and a washing machine running a load of dark clothing when Maria Gonzalez arrived. The home's elaborate security system, which included motion-activated cameras covering all entrances, had been disabled at 1:48 a.m., according to the system's digital log, with Kevin's personal code used to deactivate it. Cell phone records showed that Kevin's phone had connected to the home's Wi-Fi until 1:52 a.m., then reconnected briefly at 4:17 a.m., before disconnecting again until 5:35 a.m., when it connected to a coffee shop's network in downtown San Diego, consistent with his claim of an early breakfast meeting. These digital breadcrumbs, meticulously assembled by the Technical Crimes Unit, allowed investigators to construct a damning timeline. Kevin disabled the home security system, left to purchase murder supplies, returned to commit the crimes, attempted to clean up evidence, then established an alibi by appearing at a public location shortly after the estimated time of death. Back at police headquarters, Detective Mason Davis and his partner, Detective Sarah Rodriguez, conducted a second interview with Kevin Keith, this time armed with the security footage and timeline contradictions that had emerged during the day's investigation. Kevin maintained his original story with remarkable composure, explaining away the hardware store visit as a quick errand he had forgotten to mention, claiming he needed the items for a production set issue and had paid cash out of habit. His explanation for disabling the security system, that he didn't want to wake the family when leaving for his errand, struck the detectives as implausible, given that the system could be programmed to silently alert only if exterior doors were breached. Throughout the interview, Keevan remained outwardly cooperative but increasingly evasive when pressed on specific inconsistencies, frequently redirecting conversation to his grief and shock, asking repeatedly about funeral arrangements, and questioning why detectives were wasting time interviewing him when the real killer is out there. The forensic evidence collected from the scene told a story that contradicted Keevan's claims of innocence at every turn. DNA analysis confirmed that blood found on the master bathroom shower drain matched Sophia's, suggesting Keevan had showered after killing her to remove evidence. A partial bloody fingerprint on the kitchen knife used to stab Lily matched Keevan's right index finger, despite apparent attempts to wipe the handle clean. The work gloves purchased at the hardware store were discovered hidden in the garage, tucked inside a paint can, with microscopic blood spatter from all 3 victims detected on their surface. Most damning of all, fibers recovered from the zip ties binding Sophia's wrists matched those from the distinctive sweater Keevan had been wearing in the hardware store security footage, a unique cashmere blend with identifiable blue thread components that the crime lab technician described as a forensic fingerprint, linking the suspect directly to the restraints used on the victim. As the first day of investigation drew to a close, Detective Davis obtained a search warrant for Keevan Keith's personal and business financial records based on information provided by Eleanor Taylor regarding Sophia's discovery of disturbing financial documents. The warrant, executed late that evening, allowed investigators to seize computers, files, and digital storage devices from both the home and Keevan's production company office in downtown San Diego. The financial aspect of the investigation would prove crucial in establishing motive, though it would take forensic accountants several days to unravel the complex web of transactions that Keevan had created to conceal his activities. By midnight on April 3rd, barely 24 hours after the estimated time of the murders, investigators had gathered enough physical evidence, digital data, and witness testimony to justify Keevan Keith's formal arrest, though Detective Davis made the strategic decision to continue building the case before taking him into custody, allowing the suspect to believe he was still successfully maintaining his facade of innocence. The media descended on La Jolla within hours of the initial police response, news helicopters hovering over the oceanfront property, while reporters stationed themselves at the perimeter established by police. By evening, the story had gone national, with cable news networks running breaking coverage of the Hollywood family tragedy, and entertainment websites publishing retrospectives of Sophia Keith's groundbreaking commercial work alongside heartbreaking family photos culled from social media. Keevan Keith, still presenting himself as the grieving husband and father, gave a brief statement through the family's security gate, his voice breaking as he asked for privacy during this unimaginable time and promised to cooperate fully with police to find whoever did this to my beautiful girls. The performance, watched live by millions, was described by body language experts as too controlled and lacking authentic emotional indicators, though viewers without specialized training largely responded with sympathy for the man they believed had lost everything. Throughout the night and into the following day, forensic teams continued processing the sprawling crime scene, uncovering additional evidence with each passing hour. The children's bedrooms told particularly heartbreaking stories. In Lily's room, investigators found a trail of blood suggesting she had hidden under her bed before trying to run, while in Harper's room, they discovered the toddler's bedding had been changed, with the original sheets found in the washing machine, suggesting she may have been killed while sleeping before being repositioned. Blood spatter analysis in the master bedroom indicated Sophia had been attacked from behind, likely while sitting at her vanity, with defensive wounds suggesting she had briefly broken free before being subdued with the zip ties. These forensic details allowed investigators to reconstruct the likely sequence of events. Keevan had attacked Sophia first, then dealt with each child in turn, with the varying methods of killing suggesting adaptations to unexpected circumstances, particularly in Lily's case, where the planned zip-tie method had to be abandoned when she attempted to flee. Detective Mason Davis had built his reputation on methodical attention to detail, a quality that served him well as he reviewed the security footage from the hardware store for the fourth time in the conference room of the San Diego Police Department's Homicide Division. With each viewing, Kevin Keith's actions revealed new layers of premeditation, the careful selection of items from different parts of the store to avoid appearing to purchase them as a set, the momentary hesitation before returning his credit card to his wallet and paying with cash instead, the baseball cap pulled low but not so low as to trigger suspicion from store employees. "He's trying to be forgettable," Davis remarked to Detective Rodriguez as they watched Keith interact briefly with the night manager, Trevor Winters. "Notice how he's not avoiding eye contact completely, which would be memorable, but he's not engaging either. He's aiming for the middle ground where retail workers see dozens of faces that all blend together by the end of a shift." The timestamp on the footage showed Keith entering the store at 2:07 a.m. and leaving at 2:15 a.m., carrying a plastic bag containing what investigators now knew were the implements he would use to murder his family less than 2 hours later. This 8-minute shopping trip shattered the carefully constructed alibi Keith had provided during his initial police interview, where he claimed to have been home in bed until leaving for his early breakfast meeting at 5:30 a.m. When confronted with this discrepancy during his second interview, Keith had appeared momentarily startled before quickly composing himself and offering an explanation that struck investigators as both rehearsed and implausible. "I completely forgot about that quick errand," he had stated, with casual dismissiveness, as if running out at 2 a.m. for zip ties and bleach were a routine occurrence. "I had a production emergency, needed those supplies for a set issue being addressed early this morning, and didn't mention it because it seemed irrelevant, given what's happened to my family." This hastily constructed cover story unraveled further when detectives contacted the production company where Keith claimed the set emergency had occurred, only to discover that no such emergency existed and the production in question had wrapped 2 weeks earlier. The company's production manager expressed shock at Keith's claim, stating, "We haven't had an active set since March 18th, and we certainly wouldn't be calling Kevin in the middle of the night for supplies, even if we did." Phone records subpoenaed by investigators confirmed no calls to or from Keith's phone between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m., contradicting his assertion that he had received an urgent request. The hardware store visit, initially just a crack in Keith's alibi, had now become a gaping hole through which his entire narrative was collapsing, revealing a carefully planned sequence of actions designed to acquire murder weapons while establishing plausible deniability. As Detective Davis dug deeper into Kevin Keith's background, a pattern of concerning behavior emerged that had been largely concealed beneath his successful professional persona. Interviews with colleagues from his production company revealed a man with extraordinary charm and persuasiveness when things were going his way, but who could become coldly manipulative or explosively angry when challenged. A former assistant described an incident where Keith had thrown a heavy glass paperweight at a wall during a budget disagreement just inches from her head, then immediately switched to a calm, reasonable demeanor when an important client entered the room. Another colleague recalled Keith boasting about financially destroying a writer who had attempted to sue him for stealing script concepts, saying, "He'll never work in this town again, and neither will his children, if he has any." These accounts painted a picture of a man with remarkable emotional control who used it not for self-regulation, but for calculated effect, alternately deploying charm, intimidation, or apparent vulnerability, depending on what would most effectively achieve his aims. The inconsistencies in Kevin's statements about his whereabouts on the night of the murders extended beyond the hardware store visit. Cell phone tower data placed his phone near the beach approximately a mile from his home at 3:12 a.m., contradicting his claim of returning directly home after purchasing the supplies. Detectives theorized this detour might represent a period of preparation or steeling himself for what he was about to do, or possibly even an aborted disposal of evidence that was later moved. A night security guard at a neighboring property reported seeing a man matching Keith's description walking along the beach access path around 3 a.m., but had thought nothing of it at the time, as late-night beach walks were not uncommon in the area. When shown a photo array, the guard identified Keith with 85% certainty, noting the distinctive way he walked with his hands in his pockets. This additional witness placing Keith outside his home during the critical time window further undermined his already crumbling alibi and suggested a timeline where he had potentially left the house a second time after committing the murders. Keevan's financial activities in the weeks leading up to the murders raised equally troubling questions as forensic accountants began unraveling his complex web of accounts. Bank records showed he had withdrawn a total of $45,000 in cash through multiple transactions, kept just under the $10,000 reporting threshold, classic structuring behavior designed to avoid triggering automatic bank reporting requirements. He had also applied for 3 new credit cards in the month before the murders, maxing them out immediately with cash advances. Most suspiciously, he had contacted his life insurance agent 2 months prior to increase the coverage on Sophia from $1 million to $5 million, with himself as the sole beneficiary, a change that had gone into effect just 3 weeks before her murder. These financial maneuvers suggested not only a man in dire financial straits, but one who was actively planning for a future that did not include his wife. Keevan's initially convincing display of grief began to appear increasingly hollow as investigators reviewed footage from the crime scene and subsequent press appearances. Dr. Miriam Foster, a forensic psychologist consulting on the case, noted the performative nature of his emotional displays, pointing out how Keith's expressions of distress tended to intensify when cameras were present or when speaking with individuals who could influence public opinion about him. What we're seeing is the selective deployment of grief behaviors, Dr. Foster explained in her report to the investigation team, with more authentic micro-expressions of anger, calculation, and even relief, visible in unguarded moments when he doesn't realize he's being observed. Police body camera footage captured one such revealing moment, as officers stepped away to confer, leaving Keith briefly alone in an interview room. His devastated expression immediately shifted to one of impatient annoyance as he checked his watch, only to snap back into grief when the door began to open. The timeline Detective Davis had constructed by the end of the first week of investigation left little doubt about Kevin Keith's guilt. Security cameras at the gated community entrance showed Keith's Range Rover exiting at 1:54 a.m. and returning at 2:23 a.m., perfectly aligning with his hardware store visit. The home security system, which Keith had personally deactivated at 1:48 a.m., remained off until 4:22 a.m. when it was reactivated, creating a window of approximately 2 hours during which the murders took place. Medical examiner Dr. Chen's final report narrowed the estimated time of death to between 2:30 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. for all 3 victims, based on stomach contents, body temperature, and biochemical markers. Sophia's smartwatch, which continued recording heart rate data until it detected no pulse at 2:47 a.m., provided the most precise timestamp of her death, showing a sudden spike in heart rate at 2:41 a.m. consistent with a struggle or fear response, followed by cardiac cessation 6 minutes later. The physical evidence connecting Keevan to the murders mounted daily as forensic analysis results came in. Despite his apparently careful cleanup efforts, blood evidence was found in minute quantities throughout the home, including traces of Lily's blood on the steering wheel of Keevan's Range Rover, suggesting he had driven somewhere after attacking her, possibly during the unexplained beach visit. A single strand of Keevan's hair was discovered entwined in the zip tie used to secure the plastic bag around Harper's neck. A devastating piece of evidence given that Keevan had claimed not to have entered the children's rooms that night. The kitchen knife used to stab Lily had been wiped clean of fingerprints but contained microscopic blood residue in the handle's textured grip that matched Keevan's DNA, indicating he had cut himself slightly while using it. Most damning of all, the work gloves purchased at the hardware store and later found hidden in the garage contained transfer evidence from all 3 crime scenes. Sophia's foundation makeup, fibers from Lily's pajamas, and traces of baby lotion used on Harper daily, creating a forensic link showing the same person had attacked all 3 victims. Detective Rodriguez led the technological side of the investigation, uncovering digital evidence that pointed to extensive premeditation. Keith's search history, recovered from his laptop despite attempts to delete it, showed queries for undetectable poisons, how to stage home invasion, and children inheritance if both parents die in the weeks leading up to the murders. His Netflix viewing history revealed multiple true crime documentaries focused on family annihilators and botched murder investigations, suggesting he was studying techniques and mistakes to avoid. Most chilling was a note found in his encrypted cloud storage titled Contingencies, which listed various scenarios and responses should he come under suspicion, including which family members to contact first, specific emotional talking points for media appearances, and lawyers to retain based on different types of evidence that might emerge. The methodical nature of these preparations, combined with the financial maneuvers and physical evidence, painted a picture not of a crime of passion, but of a coldly calculated plan to eliminate his family. As the investigation progressed, detectives uncovered evidence suggesting Keevan had conducted a dress rehearsal approximately 2 weeks before the murders. A different hardware store's security camera had captured him purchasing a similar set of items, including zip ties and garbage bags, which were never found in the home searches. Neighbors reported seeing him digging in a remote area of the property's extensive gardens late at night, with motion-activated security lights illuminating his activities. When investigators excavated the area based on these reports, they discovered the remnants of burned zip ties and plastic, suggesting Keith had tested his murder methods and disposal techniques before carrying out the actual killings. This evidence of rehearsal further undermined any possibility that the crimes were committed in a moment of rage or temporary insanity, instead pointing to a man who had methodically planned and prepared for murdering his family, practicing to ensure he could carry out the acts efficiently when the time came. By the 10th day of the investigation, Detective Mason Davis had assembled what he described as one of the strongest circumstantial cases I've seen in 15 years of homicide work, with multiple independent lines of evidence all pointing to Kevin Keith as the sole perpetrator. The security footage showing the purchase of murder implements, the forensic evidence linking those implements directly to the crime scenes, the financial motive established through accounting records, the digital evidence of premeditation, the failed alibi, and the behavioral inconsistencies observed by multiple witnesses collectively created a compelling case that left little room for reasonable doubt. What remained unclear was exactly what had triggered Keith to act on April 3rd specifically, rather than earlier or later, a question that would be answered only when investigators finally gained access to Sophia Keith's password-protected laptop and discovered the emails she had exchanged with the family's financial advisor just days before her death. The breakthrough in establishing Kevin Keith's motive came 5 days into the investigation when digital forensic specialists finally bypassed the encryption on Sophia Keith's password-protected laptop. The contents revealed a woman who had been methodically investigating financial discrepancies she had discovered while reviewing joint tax documents in preparation for their annual filing. Email exchanges between Sophia and the couple's accountant showed her growing concern about unexplained withdrawals from production company accounts to which she had limited access as a project participant. "I'm seeing transfers totaling over $800,000 to an LLC I'm not familiar with," she had written 3 weeks before her death. "As a profit participant in the Horizon project, I should have been notified of any major fund movements." The accountant's cautious response suggested he too had concerns, but was hesitant to put them in writing, requesting an in-person meeting that had been scheduled for April 5th, 2 days after Sophia was killed. Forensic accountants brought in by the prosecution spent weeks untangling the elaborate financial scheme Kevin Keith had constructed, eventually documenting embezzlement totaling approximately $4.2 million from his production company and investor funds over a 3-year period. The money had been funneled through a series of shell companies with legitimate-sounding production-related names like Coastal Grip and Electric Services and Premier Cast Talent Management, which existed only on paper and provided no actual services to Keith's productions. Bank records showed these funds ultimately flowing to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Belize, then returning as personal loans to Keith from fictional foreign investors, allowing him to maintain his family's lavish lifestyle despite his company's increasingly precarious financial position. Detective Davis noted in his case summary that Keith had created a classic Ponzi scheme structure within his own business, using new investor funds to cover previous misappropriations while continuing to siphon money for personal use. The most damning piece of evidence regarding motive emerged from Sophia's final Google searches the night before her murder, which included queries for how to report embezzlement, whistleblower protections, entertainment industry, and financial fraud evidence requirements. Her search history revealed a woman who had moved from initial suspicion to certainty about her husband's crimes and was actively researching how to address the situation legally. A draft email found in her outbox, never sent and dated April 2nd at 11:47 p.m., was addressed to her personal attorney and began, "I need urgent advice regarding financial crimes I've discovered my husband committing. I have documentation of what appears to be systematic embezzlement from his production company and investors. I'm concerned about potential legal exposure for myself, even though I had no knowledge or participation in these schemes." This unfinished message, written just hours before her murder, established both Sophia's knowledge of Kevin's crimes and his clear motive for silencing her before she could expose him. Interviews with production company employees and business partners painted a picture of mounting pressure on Kevin Keith in the weeks leading up to the murders. His latest production had significantly exceeded its budget while generating disappointing viewership numbers, leading major streaming platform executives to question his previously stellar reputation. 3 investors had requested audit meetings scheduled for mid-April, which would have inevitably exposed the financial irregularities Sophia had discovered. Keith's assistant recalled him becoming increasingly erratic, alternating between uncharacteristic generosity, giving her an expensive watch as a just-because gift, and alarming outbursts over minor issues like coffee orders or scheduling conflicts. A business partner described a lunch meeting 2 days before the murders where Keith appeared distracted and made an odd comment about starting fresh somewhere nobody knows your name, which seemed insignificant at the time but took on sinister meaning in light of subsequent events. The financial pressures extended beyond Kevin's business affairs into the couple's personal finances, where investigators discovered a facade of prosperity, concealing significant debt and cash flow problems. Despite their $4.2 million La Jolla mansion, luxury vehicles, and lavish lifestyle, the Keith family was functionally insolvent at the time of the murders, with mortgage payments 3 months in arrears, though hidden from Sophia through intercepted mail. credit card debt exceeding $175,000 across multiple accounts, and private school tuition for Lily overdue by 2 billing cycles. Banking records showed multiple instances where Kevin had moved funds from Sophia's personal accounts to cover shortfalls, using his access as a joint account holder but without her knowledge or consent, as evidenced by her confused text messages to him questioning declining balances. The life insurance policy on Sophia that Kevin had recently increased to $5 million appeared to be his planned financial solution, providing both immediate capital and an explanation for any lifestyle adjustments he would need to make as a grieving widower, scaling back his professional commitments. Detective Rodriguez's analysis of the couple's digital communications revealed a stark contrast between public perception and private reality. While their social media accounts showcased an enviable partnership of mutual support and romantic gestures, their text messages told a story of growing tension and separate lives. In the 3 months before the murders, communications between Kevin and Sophia had become increasingly functional and businesslike, primarily concerning children's schedules and household logistics, with almost no affectionate content. Kevin's messages showed patterns of subtle control and monitoring, frequently questioning Sophia's whereabouts or who she was meeting, while her responses grew progressively more guarded and brief. The most revealing exchange occurred just 1 week before the murders, when Sophia texted, "We need to have a serious conversation about our future and finances when I return from the commercial shoot. There are things I've discovered that can't be ignored anymore." Kevin's response, "Of course, babe, can't wait to have you home. Let's plan a special date night," represented what Dr. Foster identified as classic manipulation through false acquiescence, buying time while planning an alternative solution to the confrontation. The case against Kevin Keith strengthened considerably when investigators linked the foundational clue, the security footage showing his late-night hardware store purchases, directly to the forensic evidence from the crime scenes. The zip ties used to restrain Sophia and Harper were confirmed by the manufacturer to be from the same production batch as those sold at the hardware store visited by Keith, with distinctive molding marks from a specific factory machine visible under microscopic examination. The plastic bag used to suffocate Harper matched the unique thickness, dimension, and logo placement of the brand sold exclusively by that hardware store chain. Most conclusively, chemical analysis of bleach residue found on the bathroom tiles matched the specific formulation of the brand purchased by Keith that night, with investigators determining that he had attempted to clean blood spatter in the master bathroom, but had missed microscopic traces that became visible under luminol testing. These connections created an unbreakable chain linking Keith's suspicious middle-of-the-night purchases directly to the implements and evidence of the murders. Psychological profiling by Dr. Foster provided additional context for understanding the family annihilation aspect of the crimes, explaining why Keith had killed not only Sophia, the immediate threat to his freedom and reputation, but also his young daughters. In cases where financial fraud is the underlying motive for spousal murder, we often see the elimination of children as well, particularly when they're old enough to potentially serve as witnesses, Dr. Foster explained in her report to prosecutors. But beyond the practical elimination of witnesses, family annihilators with narcissistic tendencies like those exhibited by Mr. Keith tend to view their family as extensions of themselves rather than as autonomous individuals. When their carefully constructed false identity is threatened, they may choose to destroy these extensions rather than risk having them exist in a world where the annihilator's true nature and failures have been exposed. This analysis helped investigators understand the particularly calculated methods used to kill each victim, with the different approaches reflecting both practical adaptations and psychological aspects of Keith's relationship with each family member. The investigation also uncovered evidence suggesting the murders had been Keith's Plan B after failing in an attempt to frame Sophia for the financial crimes he had committed. Email drafts found on his personal laptop outlined a strategy for doctoring financial documents to make it appear that Sophia had been the one misappropriating funds, including creating backdated electronic signatures and fabricated correspondence. A USB drive hidden in his office contained modified versions of company financial records with Sophia's digital signature added to fraudulent transaction authorizations. These documents were dated approximately 3 weeks before the murders, suggesting Keith had first attempted to create a narrative where Sophia was the criminal before realizing her own discovery of his activities had progressed too far for this strategy to succeed. Detective Davis theorized that when Keith realized he could not redirect blame effectively, he switched to the more drastic solution of eliminating the threat entirely, choosing to commit murder rather than face the public humiliation and legal consequences of his financial crimes being exposed. As Detective Davis prepared to make an arrest, the final pieces of the case fell into place with the discovery of what appeared to be Kevin Keith's escape plan. A search of his office safe revealed $50,000 in cash, a passport issued in a variation of his name, Kevin K. Jameson, and printed confirmations for a one-way flight to Venezuela, which has no extradition treaty with the United States, scheduled for April 15th. The booking had been made using a prepaid credit card purchased with cash 6 weeks before the murders, suggesting long-term planning rather than a panicked response. Also found were handwritten notes outlining a new identity, including details such as a fictional background as a retired investment banker and language learning materials for Spanish. These discoveries painted a picture of a man who had planned not only to eliminate his family, but also to escape justice, intending to disappear with life insurance proceeds once the initial investigation had passed its most intensive phase. The totality of evidence assembled by the investigation team left little doubt about both the how and why of the Keith family murders. Kevin Keith, facing financial ruin and potential criminal prosecution for his embezzlement scheme, had chosen to murder his wife when she discovered his crimes and was preparing to expose him. The killing of his daughters appeared to be a combination of eliminating potential witnesses and a narcissistic inability to allow his family to exist, apart from his control, once his carefully constructed facade of success was threatened. The security footage showing him purchasing the murder implements at 2 a.m. served as the linchpin, connecting him directly to the crimes, while the financial investigation provided the clear motive that had driven him to such extreme action. By the time Detective Davis arrived at Keith's attorney's office with an arrest warrant on April 13th, 10 days after the murders, the case against Kevin Keith had evolved from circumstantial to virtually irrefutable, supported by physical evidence, digital forensics, financial records, witness testimony, and psychological analysis that collectively told the story of a man who had chosen to destroy his family rather than face the consequences of his own actions. Kevin Keith's arrest occurred not at his blood-stained mansion, which remained an active crime scene, but at the sleek downtown San Diego offices of Bernstein and Kavanaugh, the high-powered defense attorneys he had retained 3 days after the murders. Detective Mason Davis, accompanied by Detective Rodriguez and 4 uniformed officers, arrived at precisely 9:15 a.m. on April 13th, having strategically timed the arrest to coincide with a scheduled meeting between Keith and his legal team. The detectives had deliberately chosen a public setting to minimize any potential for violent resistance and to maximize the psychological impact on Keith, forcing him to maintain his facade of composed innocence in front of witnesses while being taken into custody. As Davis entered the plush conference room, legal documents in hand, He noted that Keith showed no surprise at the officer's appearance, suggesting he had anticipated this moment and prepared himself for it. "Kevin Keith, you are under arrest for the murders of Sophia Keith, Lily Keith, and Harper Keith," Detective Davis announced formally, his voice steady as he read the Miranda rights in full view of Keith's attorneys, who immediately began protesting the theatrical nature of the arrest and demanding to see the warrant. Keith himself remained eerily calm as he was handcuffed, his only visible reaction a slight tightening around his eyes as the reality of his situation became concrete. "This is a mistake that will ruin your career, Detective," Keith stated quietly as he was led through the law firm's lobby, where stunned secretaries and paralegals watched the producer, who had been a fixture in entertainment news, being escorted out in handcuffs. "I loved my family more than anything in this world, and I will be vindicated." The calculated nature of this public statement, made within earshot of multiple potential witnesses, struck Davis as further evidence of Keith's ongoing performance, a man still working to shape the narrative even as it collapsed around him. The interrogation room at San Diego Police Department headquarters was deliberately stark, designed to create a psychological contrast with the luxury Keith had surrounded himself with throughout his adult life. A simple metal table, 4 chairs, a one-way observation mirror, and overhead fluorescent lighting that cast unflattering shadows comprised the setting where Detective Davis would conduct what he knew might be the most important interview of his career. Keith's attorneys had advised him not to speak to police without legal representation present, but Davis was banking on the producer's narcissistic belief in his own persuasiveness and ability to control situations through charm and manipulation. "Most guilty men with resources listen to their lawyers," Davis later explained to the prosecution team, "but narcissists like Keith often believe they're smarter than everyone else in the room, including their own counsel. They can't resist the opportunity to perform, to convince others of their innocence, especially when their self-image is built around being likable and persuasive." The detective's psychological assessment proved accurate. Despite his attorney's explicit instructions, Keith agreed to speak with detectives to clear this terrible misunderstanding once and for all, signing the waiver of rights with a flourish that suggested confidence rather than concern. The interrogation began at 11:42 a.m., with Keith maintaining the same composed demeanor he had displayed since the murders, his voice modulated to convey appropriate grief without veering into excessive emotion that might appear theatrical. For the first 40 minutes, Davis allowed Keith to control the conversation, to retell his version of events with minimal interruption, creating a false sense of security that the detective would later exploit. "I was in bed beside my wife until around 5:30 that morning," Keith stated with practiced conviction, looking directly into Davis's eyes. "I kissed Sophia goodbye, checked on the girls as I always do, and left for my breakfast meeting downtown." That's the simple truth, Detective, despite whatever circumstantial evidence you think you have. The shift in the interrogation's tone came abruptly when Detective Davis silently placed a manila folder on the table between them and removed a series of still images from the hardware store security footage, laying them out one by one in a row. Each image showed Keith selecting the items later used in the murders: the zip ties, the garbage bags, the bleach, the work gloves, his face clearly identifiable despite the baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "This is you at 2:13 a.m. on April 3rd, Kevin," Davis stated flatly, "purchasing the exact items used to murder your family less than 2 hours later." The blood visibly drained from Keith's face as he stared at the images, his carefully maintained composure cracking for the first time since his arrest. After several seconds of silence, Keith attempted to recover, claiming, as he had in previous interviews, that he had simply forgotten this errand when providing his timeline, but his voice now lacked the confident resonance it had carried moments earlier, and a slight tremor in his hands betrayed the impact of this concrete evidence. Building methodically on this first breach in Keith's facade, Detective Davis began laying out the case piece by piece, presenting each element not as a question, but as an established fact, a technique designed to overwhelm the suspect with the comprehensive nature of the evidence against him. "We have the zip ties from the store, matching those used on Sophia and Harper," Davis stated, placing forensic comparison photos on the table. "We have your DNA on the kitchen knife used to stab Lily 17 times. We have your hair entwined in the zip tie around the plastic bag that suffocated your 2-year-old daughter. We have luminol revealing Sophia's blood in your shower drain despite your cleaning attempts. We have your cell phone pinging towers near the beach at 3:12 a.m. when you claim you were home sleeping. We have a witness who saw you on the beach access path that night. We have your web searches for undetectable poisons and how to stage home invasions. At what point, Keevan, do you acknowledge that this story you're telling simply doesn't hold up against the physical evidence?" The most significant shift in the interrogation occurred when Detective Davis introduced evidence of the financial crimes that had motivated the murders. "We've spoken with the investors you defrauded, Keevan," Davis said, his tone deliberately conversational as he placed bank statements and financial transfer records on the table. "We know about the $4.2 million you embezzled through fake vendor companies. We've read Sophia's emails and searches from the night before you killed her, where she was researching how to report your crimes. We found the draft email to her attorney that she never got to send, where she explicitly states she's discovered your embezzlement and fears legal exposure." As Davis spoke, he watched Keith's micro-expression cycle rapidly through shock, calculation, and a fleeting flash of what appeared to be rage before settling into a mask of indignation. "These financial matters are complex business dealings that have been misinterpreted," Keith responded, his voice regaining some of its earlier steadiness. "Sophia didn't understand the industry's financial structures. This is a tragic coincidence being twisted to fit your theory." Detective Rodriguez entered the interrogation room at this point, bringing with her the evidence that would most directly connect Keith's financial motive to the timing of the murders. She placed on the table printed copies of calendar invitations found on Sophia's laptop, showing meetings scheduled with the production company's primary investor on April 6th, and with a forensic accountant on April 8th. "Sophia wasn't just suspecting your crimes, Keevan," Rodriguez stated calmly. "She was actively assembling a case against you, and she was going to present it to the very people who could immediately verify her allegations and take action. You didn't kill her in a momentary rage. You killed her because April 3rd was your last opportunity to prevent her from exposing you." Keith's response was telling. Rather than denying the accusation, he fell silent, his eyes fixed on the calendar entries as if seeing in them the collapse of all his remaining defenses. The interrogation reached its psychological climax when Detective Davis placed the final piece of evidence on the table, the materials found in Keith's office safe indicating his planned escape to Venezuela. "You purchased this one-way ticket 6 weeks ago, Keevan," Davis noted, pushing the printed confirmation toward Keith. "That's significant because it tells us this wasn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous reaction to Sophia discovering your fraud. You planned to kill your family and flee the country weeks in advance, creating a new identity as Keevan Jameson with $50,000 in cash and a passport variation. You didn't just betray your family, you premeditated their murders with cold calculation." At this accusation, something in Keith finally broke, not into confession or remorse, but into a cold anger. That revealed glimpses of the man behind the carefully maintained mask of the grieving husband and father. "You have no idea what pressures I've been under," Keith responded, his voice now stripped of its performative grief and revealing an underlying hardness that detectives had not previously witnessed. "Do you know what it takes to maintain a position in this industry? To keep up appearances when every streaming service is cutting budgets? To support a wife whose career was taking off while mine was being questioned? To maintain a standard of living that everyone expects? As he spoke, Keith's emphasis shifted subtly from defending himself against the murder accusations to justifying the financial crimes that had preceded them, a telling psychological slip that Davis recognized as the closest they were likely to get to a confession at this stage. The detectives exchanged a glance, both recognizing that Keith's defensive focus on the embezzlement rather than the murders themselves represented a significant breakthrough, an implicit acknowledgement of the financial motive that had driven him to eliminate his family. Throughout the 6-hour interrogation, Keith maintained his formal innocence regarding the murders while gradually revealing more of his true personality as his practiced facade eroded under the weight of the evidence presented. In moments when he believed the recording devices had been turned off during breaks, he made comments to Detective Davis that took on sinister significance in context, including asking about the quality of accommodations for high-profile defendants and inquiring whether the prosecution would seek the death penalty in a case like this, despite ostensibly believing himself to be wrongfully accused. During one such break, when Davis mentioned that the children's grandparents were planning the funeral service, Keith's immediate response was to ask about insurance claim processing timelines rather than expressing any emotional reaction to his daughter's burial arrangements, a telling prioritization that further convinced investigators of his guilt. The interrogation concluded at 5:37 p.m. when Keith's attorneys, having discovered their client had waived his rights against their advice, burst into the room demanding an immediate end to questioning. By this point, the detectives had already achieved their primary objectives, documenting Keith's inability to explain the overwhelming physical evidence against him, capturing his psychological shift from performed grief to authentic anger when cornered, and most importantly, establishing through his own statements a timeline of financial motives and pressures that aligned perfectly with the prosecution's theory of the case. As Keith was led back to his cell, Detective Davis noted in his case journal that despite never formally confessing, Keith had effectively confirmed the case against him through 1,000 small tells, the micro-expressions of rage when Sophia's discoveries were mentioned, the shift to financial justifications when pressured about the murders, and the complete absence of genuine emotion when discussing his children's deaths. Following the interrogation, the prosecution team met to assess the strength of their case, with District Attorney Eleanor Simmons ultimately deciding to charge Kevin Keith with 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, making him eligible for the death penalty under California law. The security footage showing Keith purchasing the murder weapons, combined with the financial motive established through forensic accounting and Sophia's own documentation of her discoveries, creates one of the strongest premeditated murder cases I've seen in 20 years of prosecution, Simmons told reporters at the press conference announcing the charges. The hardware store security footage, originally discovered through standard investigative procedure, had become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The irrefutable visual evidence connecting Keith directly to the planned and deliberate murder of his family, captured by a security camera he had failed to notice or had believed would never be checked by investigators. As Keith was processed into the San Diego Central Jail to await trial, Detective Davis completed his case summary by noting that the suspect had maintained his performance of innocence until the very end, requesting that jail staff address him as Mr. Keith rather than by his inmate number, and asking whether he would be segregated from common criminals during his incarceration. These final requests, documented in the booking records, provided one last glimpse into the psychology of a man who had valued his social status and public perception so highly that he had chosen to eliminate his family rather than face exposure for his financial crimes. The security footage showing him purchasing zip ties and bleach at 2 a.m., initially just one piece of evidence among many, had ultimately become the thread that unraveled his entire carefully constructed narrative, connecting him directly to the premeditated murder of the very people he had claimed to love above all others. The San Diego County Superior Courthouse stood as an imposing backdrop of marble and glass against the clear blue California sky on September 18, 2023, as the trial of Kevin Keith officially began amid unprecedented media attention and public interest. Television trucks with satellite uplinks lined the surrounding streets, their crews jostling for position to capture footage of key players entering the building for what had already been dubbed the producer's plot by cable news networks. Inside, Courtroom 3A had been specially prepared for the high-profile proceedings, with additional security measures implemented after threats had been received against both the defendant and the prosecution team. The gallery was filled to capacity with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had lined up since dawn to secure a seat. While outside, a crowd gathered behind barricades, some holding photographs of Sophia, Lily, and Harper as silent testimony to the lives that had been extinguished. Kevin Keith entered the courtroom at precisely 9:01 a.m., escorted by sheriff's deputies but no longer in handcuffs, having been allowed to wear a tailored Navy suit rather than jail attire, a concession his defense team had successfully argued for to prevent prejudicing the jury. The transformation in his appearance since his arrest 5 months earlier was striking. He had lost weight, his previously perfect hair now showing strands of premature gray, his posture less commanding than the confident stride that had characterized his presence in the entertainment industry. Yet observers noted that his eyes remained calculatingly alert as they scanned the courtroom, lingering briefly on each juror's face before settling into an expression of solemn dignity that appeared carefully rehearsed for maximum sympathetic impact. Eleanor Taylor, Sophia's mother, and now the guardian of her granddaughter's memory, sat in the front row directly across from Keith, her gaze never wavering from the man accused of destroying her family, her stillness projecting a quiet determination to see justice served, regardless of the emotional cost of enduring the graphic details that would emerge during the proceedings. Judge Anthony Ramirez, known for his no-nonsense approach to high-profile cases, began with a stern admonition to both the gallery and the attorneys regarding courtroom decorum and media restrictions. "This courtroom is not a television studio or a theater," he stated firmly, looking directly at the bank of cameras permitted for the opening statements only. "It is the venue where serious allegations of the most grave nature will be examined through the lens of our justice system, and I will not tolerate any attempt to transform these proceedings into spectacle or entertainment." His words set the tone for what would follow, a methodical legal examination of horrific acts, with the prosecution's case built piece by piece according to the strict evidentiary standards required by California law. Judge Ramirez's reputation for impartiality and efficiency had made him the natural choice to preside over such a high-stakes trial, with both prosecution and defense acknowledging his ability to maintain order while ensuring all legal protections for the defendant remained intact. Prosecutor Abigail Brown rose to deliver the state's opening statement, her tall figure commanding the courtroom as she moved to stand directly before the jury box, making deliberate eye contact with each of the 12 citizens who would determine Kevin Keith's fate. On April 3, 2023, the defendant, Kevin Keith, made a choice, she began, her voice clear and measured. When confronted with the collapse of the financial fraud he had perpetrated for years, when faced with his wife Sophia's discovery of his embezzlement of over $4 million, he chose to silence her permanently rather than face the consequences of his crimes. Brown's opening laid out the prosecution's narrative without hyperbole or theatrical flourishes, allowing the stark facts to create their own impact as she methodically outlined how Keith had purchased the murder implements in the middle of the night, returned home to kill his family using 3 distinct methods, attempted to clean up evidence, and created an alibi for himself, all while planning an eventual escape to Venezuela with a new identity and the life insurance proceeds from his wife's death. The centerpiece of Brown's opening statement was the presentation of the security footage showing Keith purchasing zip ties and bleach at 2:13 a.m. on the night of the murders, displayed on large screens visible to both the jury and the gallery. This video is not subject to interpretation or explanation, Brown stated, as the footage played in silence, the time stamp clearly visible in the corner of the frame. This is Kevin Keith, captured on camera purchasing the exact items later used to murder his wife and daughters at a time when he claimed to be asleep in his bed. This is not circumstantial evidence, but direct visual proof connecting the defendant to the premeditated acquisition of murder weapons just hours before his family was killed. As the jurors watched Keith's purposeful movements through the hardware store aisles, selecting items with careful deliberation before paying with cash rather than the credit card he initially produced, the courtroom remained in complete silence, the impact of this foundational piece of evidence visible in the jurors' focused expressions and occasional subtle reactions. A narrowing of eyes, a slight intake of breath, a barely perceptible nod of understanding. Brown continued by establishing the financial motive that had driven Keith to commit the murders, presenting a clear timeline that connected Sophia's discovery of the embezzlement to her planned meetings with investors and forensic accountants, scheduled for the days immediately following her death. The defendant didn't just kill his wife because she knew about his crimes, Brown explained, displaying a calendar with the key dates highlighted. He killed her because she was taking action, because she had scheduled meetings that would have exposed him to not only the end of his career, but criminal charges for financial fraud. April 3rd wasn't random. It was his last opportunity to prevent these meetings from occurring. The prosecutor then addressed the murder of the children with particular gravity, explaining the prosecution's theory that 5-year-old Lily had been killed because she was old enough to be a potential witness, while 2-year-old Harper had been killed to complete the family annihilation, allowing Keith to position himself as a grieving father rather than a husband suspected of killing his wife. Defense attorney Jeffrey Bernstein, known for representing high-profile clients in challenging cases, presented a starkly different narrative in his opening statement, focusing not on denying the security footage, but on creating an alternative explanation for Keith's actions that night. The prosecution has shown you a video of my client purchasing household items at a hardware store, Bernstein acknowledged, his tone conversational and reasonable. What they haven't shown you is the context for that purchase, the legitimate household projects Kevin was working on, the production design issues he was addressing for an upcoming shoot, the perfectly normal reasons a homeowner might need these common items. This strategy of acknowledging the undeniable while reframing its significance would become the cornerstone of the defense's approach throughout the trial, attempting to create reasonable doubt by offering alternative explanations for each piece of evidence rather than challenging its existence or authenticity. Bernstein then pivoted to what he characterized as the rush to judgment by investigators who had fixated on Kevin Keith from the first hours after this terrible tragedy, blinded to other potential suspects by their determination to build a case against a high-profile defendant. He suggested that the financial discrepancies discovered by Sophia were actually evidence of complex but legitimate business arrangements common in the entertainment industry, arrangements that appeared suspicious only to those without expertise in film production financing structures. What the prosecution calls embezzlement, Bernstein argued, financial experts will testify, was standard industry practice for managing cash flow across multiple productions with varying investor groups and distribution agreements. This attempt to recontextualize the financial evidence as legitimate business activity rather than criminal behavior represented the defense's strategy for undermining the prosecution's proposed motive, suggesting that Sophia had misinterpreted normal industry practices rather than uncovered actual fraud. The defense's most controversial claim came when Bernstein suggested an alternative perpetrator, a theory that would be expanded throughout the trial, but was introduced in the opening statement as a foundational element of reasonable doubt. While police were focusing exclusively on Kevin Keith, Bernstein told the jury, they ignored significant evidence pointing to Martin Velasquez, a former production assistant who had been fired by Sophia Keith from a commercial shoot 3 weeks before the murders, after she caught him stealing equipment. Bernstein claimed that Velasquez had made threats against Sophia that were documented in production company emails, but never properly investigated by police, and that his whereabouts during the critical hours of April 3rd remained unverified. This introduction of an alternative suspect, a standard defense tactic in murder trials, aimed to create sufficient doubt in jurors' minds about whether the prosecution had definitively proven Keith's guilt beyond all reasonable doubt. Judge Ramirez concluded the first day's proceedings by instructing the jury to keep an open mind until all evidence had been presented, reminding them of their oath to consider only the facts presented in court rather than media coverage or personal opinions about the case. As the courtroom emptied, legal analysts outside immediately began dissecting the opening statements, with most noting the prosecution's advantage in having concrete visual evidence directly linking the defendant to murder implements purchased just hours before the crimes. The security footage of Keith buying zip ties and bleach at 2 a.m. is the kind of evidence prosecutors dream about, commented legal analyst Cynthia Washington for a national news broadcast. The defense has an uphill battle to explain away not just the purchase itself, but the timing, the payment in cash, and the fact that Keith initially lied about his whereabouts during that period. Inside the courtroom, as journalists filed out and security prepared to return Keith to county jail for the night, an interaction occurred that would later be recounted by court officers during their testimony. When a deputy mentioned to Keith that his former mother-in-law had been present throughout the proceedings, Keith reportedly smiled slightly and remarked, "Eleanor always did enjoy a good performance. She should have been the one in films, not Sophia." This comment, overheard by 2 officers and noted in their daily reports, would later be introduced by the prosecution as evidence of Keith's true attitude toward his deceased wife's family and his tendency to view the trial itself as a performance rather than a genuine examination of his actions. The casual callousness of the remark, particularly given Eleanor Taylor's dignified presence throughout the day, despite the emotional toll of hearing her daughter's murder described in clinical detail, offered a glimpse behind the composed facade Keith maintained in front of the jury. As the first day of the trial concluded, the prosecution team gathered to review their strategy, with Prosecutor Brown expressing satisfaction with the jury's engaged reactions to the security footage. "You could see it in their eyes when that video played," she told her team during their evening briefing. "That moment when Keith switches from his credit card to cash. Several jurors actually leaned forward in their seats. They're seeing the premeditation, the careful planning, the deliberate choices he made." The foundational significance of this evidence, the security footage showing Keith purchasing the murder implements in the middle of the night, had been clearly established on the first day of trial, creating the framework within which all subsequent testimony would be understood. The visual power of seeing the defendant himself selecting the items later used to kill his family, at a time when he claimed to be sleeping beside his soon-to-be victims, had created precisely the impact the prosecution had hoped for: a direct, irrefutable connection between Kevin Keith and the premeditated murder of his wife and daughters. Trevor Winters, the night manager at Pacific Hardware, who had served Kevin Keith at 2:13 a.m. on April 3rd, took the stand on the third day of trial. His testimony eagerly anticipated as the human context to the security footage that had become central to the prosecution's case. Dressed in a suit that seemed slightly too large for his lanky frame, Winters appeared nervous but composed as he described his overnight shift at the 24-hour hardware store located approximately 3 miles from the Keith mansion. "We don't get many customers between 1 and 5 a.m., Winters explained in response to Prosecutor Brown's questions. "Maybe 2 or 3 on weeknights, usually contractors needing emergency supplies for early morning jobs or people who've had household emergencies, like burst pipes." This context established the unusual nature of Keith's late-night shopping trip, highlighting that his presence at that hour was already outside normal patterns even before considering the specific items purchased. Winters' recollection of the interaction proved remarkably detailed, a fact he attributed to the oddity of seeing a well-dressed man purchasing that particular combination of items in the middle of the night. "He seemed very deliberate," Winters testified, choosing his words carefully. "He wasn't rushing like someone dealing with an emergency, but he wasn't browsing either. He knew exactly what he wanted, and went directly to those items." When asked about Keith's demeanor, Winters described him as completely normal in terms of how he spoke to me, polite even, but something felt off about the situation. The clerk's most significant testimony came when describing the payment process. He initially took out a credit card, then seemed to reconsider and put it back in his wallet, saying something like, "I'll just use cash for this." That struck me as unusual because most people decide their payment method before reaching the counter, not after. During cross-examination, defense attorney Bernstein attempted to portray Winters' detailed recollection as suspicious, suggesting his memory had been influenced by media coverage of the case and coaching from the prosecution. "You've seen this security footage multiple times during preparation for your testimony, haven't you, Mr. Winters?" Bernstein asked, his tone implying that the witness's memories might have been shaped by these viewings rather than his actual experience that night. Winters acknowledged reviewing the footage with investigators, but maintained that his recollections preceded these viewings, noting that he had immediately recognized Keith when detectives first showed him a photograph, before he had seen any security footage. The defense's attempts to undermine Winters' credibility appeared largely unsuccessful, with several jurors visibly reacting to his clear and consistent testimony about Keith's careful selection of items later used in the murders. The technical testimony regarding the murder implements provided the scientific connection between Keith's hardware store purchases and the crime scene evidence. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, the forensic materials analyst who had examined the zip ties used to restrain Sophia and Harper, testified that these zip ties matched the exact brand, size, color, and manufacturing batch as those sold at Pacific Hardware. Using high-magnification photography displayed on the courtroom screens, Dr. Montgomery showed the jury the distinctive pattern of microscopic mold marks on the plastic that created a forensic fingerprint as unique as human fingerprints, allowing her to state with scientific certainty that these zip ties came from the same production run as those sold at Pacific Hardware, from a batch that had been delivered to that specific store location 3 days before the murders. Similar analysis of the plastic bag used to suffocate Harper confirmed it matched the distinctive thickness, dimension, and logo placement of the brand sold exclusively by the hardware store chain. The forensic connection extended to the chemical evidence as well, with Dr. Jennifer Ross, a chemical analyst from the FBI Crime Laboratory, testifying about the bleach residue found in the Keith home. The bleach purchased by the defendant contains a proprietary formulation with specific ratios of sodium hypochlorite, sodium hydroxide, and unique fragrance compounds, Dr. Ross explained, displaying chemical chromatography results for the jury. The residue we recovered from the bathroom tiles and shower drain in the master bathroom precisely matches this formulation, confirming it was the same brand of bleach seen in the security footage. This testimony established that Keith had not only purchased implements identical to those used in the murders, but had also used the specific cleaning agent bought that night in an attempt to remove evidence from the crime scene, creating another direct link between the security footage and the physical evidence found in the home. The financial motive for the murders was established through the testimony of Marcus Wendell, a forensic accountant who had spent 2 months analyzing Kevin Keith's business and personal financial records. Using a series of clear visual aids that transformed complex financial data into understandable patterns, Wendell walked the jury through the elaborate embezzlement scheme Keith had constructed, showing how approximately $4.2 million had been siphoned from production company accounts and investor funds over a 3-year period. The defendant created a series of shell companies with names that appeared to be legitimate production vendors, Wendell testified, displaying a diagram of money flows between entities. These companies, with names like Coastal Grip and Electric Services and Premier Cast Talent Management, existed only on paper, with no employees, no physical address beyond mail drops, and no actual services provided, yet they received regular payments from production budgets controlled by Mr. Keith. Wendell's most damning testimony came when he demonstrated how Sophia Keith had begun to discover the scheme through her examination of production financial records to which she had limited access. As a commercial director who occasionally worked with her husband's company and as a profit participant in several productions, Ms. Keith had partial access to certain financial statements, Wendell explained. In the weeks before her death, she began requesting additional documentation from the company accountant, focusing specifically on unexplained transfers to vendors she didn't recognize from her experience in the industry. Wendell displayed a timeline showing Sophia's escalating inquiries alongside Keith's increasingly desperate financial maneuvers, including taking out high-interest loans to cover cash flow gaps as new investor funds dried up. This is a classic Ponzi scheme collapse pattern, Wendell testified. Mr. Keith was within weeks of being unable to maintain the fraud, with or without Ms. Keith's discoveries. The defense attempted to counter this financial testimony by presenting their own expert witness, entertainment industry financial consultant Raymond Blackwell, who argued that the transactions identified as fraudulent by the prosecution were actually common industry practices for managing cash flow across multiple productions. What looks suspicious to traditional forensic accountants often represents standard practice in the entertainment industry, Blackwell testified during cross-examination. Shell companies, pass-through entities, and complex distribution arrangements are not inherently fraudulent, but are necessary structures in production financing. This testimony aimed to create reasonable doubt about whether Sophia had actually discovered criminal activity or merely misinterpreted legitimate but complex business arrangements, potentially undermining the prosecution's proposed motive for the murders. The prosecution effectively dismantled this alternative explanation during redirect examination of their financial experts, with Wendell demonstrating that Keith's financial structures diverged significantly from legitimate industry practices in several key ways. Legitimate production vendor companies, even if created for single projects, still have actual employees providing real services, maintain proper corporate records, and file appropriate tax documents, Wendell explained. The entities created by Mr. Keith did none of these things. Moreover, the final destination of these funds, Mr. Keith's personal accounts disguised as loans from fictional foreign investors, clearly establishes the fraudulent intent behind these structures. This testimony was bolstered by statements from actual entertainment industry executives who confirmed that Keith's financial arrangements fell well outside normal industry practices, directly contradicting the defense experts' claims. Perhaps the most emotionally impactful testimony came from Maria Gonzalez, the family's nanny who had discovered the bodies and made the 911 call. Speaking through an interpreter, despite her functional English, Gonzalez provided a human dimension to the crime scene descriptions that had previously been presented in clinical forensic terms. She described her close relationship with the children, particularly 2-year-old Harper, whom she had cared for since infancy, and recounted her final interactions with each victim the day before the murders. Lily was so excited to show me the Mother's Day card she was making in secret, Gonzalez testified, visibly struggling to maintain her composure. She made me promise not to tell her mommy about the special surprise. This testimony was followed by the presentation of the unfinished card found in Lily's craft drawer, covered with colorful hand-drawn hearts and the carefully printed words, "To the best mommy in the universe." A piece of evidence that caused several jurors to wipe away tears, and even Judge Ramirez to briefly remove his glasses, clearing his throat before instructing the prosecution to continue. Gonzalez's testimony also provided crucial insights into the family dynamics in the weeks leading up to the murders, describing increased tension between Kevin and Sophia that contrasted sharply with their public image. They were sleeping in separate rooms for at least 2 months, she testified. Ms. Sophia would ask me to stay late sometimes until Mr. Keith came home, like she didn't want to be alone with him. Gonzalez recalled overhearing an argument approximately 1 week before the murders, during which Sophia had told Kevin, "I know what you've been doing with the money and it has to stop." According to Gonzalez, Kevin had responded by telling Sophia she was being dramatic and didn't understand how the business worked, before noticing the nanny's presence and abruptly changing his tone to one of affectionate banter. This testimony provided independent corroboration of Sophia's discovery of the financial irregularities and Keith's dismissive response to her concerns, strengthening the prosecution's narrative about the escalating situation that had culminated in the murders. The testimony that most directly connected the security footage of Keith's hardware store visit to his murderous intentions came from Dr. Miriam Foster, the forensic psychologist who had analyzed Keith's behavior patterns before and after the killings. Dr. Foster explained the significance of Keith's middle-of-the-night purchase in behavioral terms that helped the jury understand its implications beyond the mere physical evidence. The timing, location, and method of this purchase reflect classic premeditation markers, Dr. Foster testified. By shopping at 2 a.m., the defendant minimized the possibility of being recognized or remembered. By initially producing a credit card but then switching to cash, he demonstrated awareness that a credit card transaction would create an electronic record of his purchase. By selecting a store 3 miles from his home rather than the hardware store just 1 mile away, he reduced the likelihood of being recognized by employees familiar with the neighborhood residents. These are not the actions of someone making an innocent purchase for household projects. They are the calculated decisions of someone attempting to acquire murder implements while minimizing connection to them. Dr. Foster also addressed the different methods used to kill each victim, explaining how these variations reflected both practical adaptations and psychological aspects of Keith's relationships with each family member. The use of zip ties to restrain Sophia before strangling her suggests a desire for control and domination in his final interaction with his wife, Foster explained. The frenzied nature of Lily's stabbing with 17 wounds indicates she likely presented an unexpected challenge to his plan, possibly waking up and attempting to flee, triggering a rage response when his careful control of the situation was threatened. The methodical suffocation of Harper, the youngest victim, with the plastic bag secured by a zip tie, represents a return to controlled execution of his plan after the chaotic attack on Lily. This psychological analysis helped jurors understand the seemingly disparate murder methods as part of a coherent narrative of a planned family annihilation that had required adaptations during its execution. The prosecution's case culminated with testimony regarding Keith's escape plan, presenting evidence of the passport issued under a variation of his name, the one-way ticket to Venezuela scheduled for April 15th, and the $50,000 in cash found in his office safe. FBI Special Agent Derek Morrison, an expert in fugitive tracking, testified about the significance of Venezuela as a destination, noting it has no extradition treaty with the United States. This combination of elements, cash that can't be traced, documentation in an alternate name, and a destination country without extradition, represents classic flight planning, Agent Morrison testified. These preparations weren't made in response to becoming a suspect. The ticket was purchased 6 weeks before the murders, indicating long-term planning and premeditation. This testimony completed the prosecution's narrative. Keith had embezzled millions, planned to murder his family when Sophia discovered his crimes, purchased the murder implements in the middle of the night, carried out the killings using those implements, attempted to clean up the evidence with the bleach he had purchased, and planned to flee the country with life insurance proceeds once the initial investigation had passed. Throughout the prosecution's case, the security footage of Keith purchasing zip ties and bleach at 2:13 a.m. remained the visual centerpiece, referenced repeatedly by witnesses and displayed multiple times for the jury. This concrete evidence connecting Keith directly to the murder implements, captured on camera just hours before the killings, created a foundation upon which all other evidence built. The forensic connections between those purchases and the crime scene, the financial motive established through accounting records, the timeline of Sophia's discoveries and planned meetings, the psychological analysis of Keith's behavior patterns, and the evidence of his escape plan. As Prosecutor Brown told the jury during a mid-trial summation, every piece of evidence in this case, every expert analysis, every witness testimony connects back to that security footage and what it reveals. Kevin Keith, purchasing the tools he would use to murder his family at 2:13 a.m. on April 3rd, when he claimed to be asleep in his bed. That is the moment the defendant's plan moved from thought to action, from contemplation to commitment, from planning to execution, and the camera caught it all. After 27 days of testimony, 112 witnesses, and over 600 pieces of evidence, the fate of Kevin Keith was placed in the hands of the 12 jurors who had sat through weeks of heartbreaking, technical, and sometimes contradictory testimony. Judge Anthony Ramirez delivered his final instructions to the jury at 10:42 a.m. on October 20th, 2023, methodically explaining the legal standards for first-degree murder with special circumstances, the requirement for unanimous verdicts, and the precise meaning of beyond reasonable doubt in criminal proceedings. You must set aside any personal feelings about the nature of these crimes, Judge Ramirez cautioned, his voice grave as he addressed the clearly exhausted jurors. Your duty is to evaluate the evidence presented in this courtroom according to the law as I have explained it to you, regardless of public opinion or media coverage you may have encountered before or during these proceedings. With these final instructions complete, the 12 men and women filed out of the courtroom to begin their deliberations, carrying with them the weight of 3 lost lives and the responsibility of determining whether Kevin Keith would spend the rest of his life in prison or face the possibility of execution. The courthouse plaza quickly filled with media encampments as news organizations from across the country and around the world prepared for what many expected would be a lengthy deliberation process, given the complexity of the case. Legal analysts on television speculated about the strength of the prosecution's case, versus the defense's alternative theories with the security footage of Keith purchasing zip ties and bleach at 2:13 a.m. consistently identified as the most damaging evidence against him. That single piece of evidence connects the defendant directly to the murder implements through his own actions, captured on camera at a time when he initially claimed to be sleeping beside his wife, noted former prosecutor Daniela Reyes on a cable news panel. Everything else in the case, the forensic evidence, the financial motive, the timeline of Sofia's discoveries, the planned escape to Venezuela, is strengthened by that foundational visual evidence that the jury has now seen multiple times. Other analysts pointed to potential weaknesses in the prosecution's case, including the circumstantial nature of the motive evidence and the defense's introduction of an alternative suspect, suggesting these elements might create sufficient reasonable doubt for at least some jurors. Inside the deliberation room, according to accounts later shared by jurors in post-trial interviews, the discussion initially centered on organizing the massive amount of information they had received during the trial. Juror number 4, a retired high school principal, suggested creating a chronological timeline of events, while juror number 8, an engineer, proposed categorizing evidence by type, physical, testimonial, financial, and digital, to evaluate the strength of each category independently. This methodical approach reflected the seriousness with which the jury approached their responsibility, with several jurors later describing the emotional toll of reviewing crime scene photographs and autopsy reports while maintaining the analytical distance necessary to evaluate the evidence fairly. We were all aware that this wasn't just another court case, juror number 7 told the San Diego Tribune in an authorized post-trial interview. This was about 3 human beings who had their lives stolen from them, including 2 innocent children, and we owed it to them to be thorough and careful with every piece of evidence. Despite expectations of a lengthy deliberation, the jury sent word to Judge Ramirez after just 6 hours that they had reached verdicts on all counts. The speed of their decision sent shockwaves through the courthouse, with legal observers suggesting it likely indicated either a complete acceptance of the prosecution's case or a total rejection of it, as lengthy deliberations typically reflect significant disagreement among jurors. As word spread that verdicts had been reached, the courtroom quickly filled beyond capacity, with spectators lining the hallways outside, hoping to witness the culmination of the trial that had captivated public attention for nearly a month. Eleanor Taylor arrived accompanied by her husband and Sofia's sister, their faces showing the strain of having endured weeks of graphic testimony about their loved ones' final moments, while sitting just feet away from the man accused of causing their deaths. Kevin Keith was brought in from the holding cell, still maintaining the composed demeanor he had displayed throughout the trial, though observers noted a slight pallor to his complexion and a tightness around his eyes suggesting the toll of awaiting the jury's decision. At 5:37 p.m., the jury filed into the courtroom, their expressions carefully neutral as they took their seats, avoiding eye contact with both the defendant and the gallery. Judge Ramirez instructed everyone present to refrain from any outbursts regardless of the verdicts, warning that anyone unable to maintain proper courtroom decorum would be immediately removed. The court clerk received the verdict forms from the jury foreperson, juror number 2, a pediatric nurse whose professional experience had made the testimony about the children's deaths particularly difficult for her to endure. After reviewing the forms to ensure they were properly completed, the clerk handed them to Judge Ramirez, who examined them briefly before returning them for reading. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the clerk stood to announce the decisions that would determine Kevin Keith's fate, with journalists poised to transmit the verdicts instantly to waiting audiences around the world. In the matter of the people of the state of California versus Kevin Keith, case number CR 2023-05871, count 1, first-degree murder of Sophia Keith with special circumstances, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The word hung in the air for a moment before a collective exhalation from the gallery broke the silence, quickly suppressed as the clerk continued. Count 2. First-degree murder of Lily Keith with special circumstances. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Count 3. First-degree murder of Harper Keith with special circumstances. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty. With each pronouncement, Kevin Keith's carefully maintained facade began to crumble visibly, his jaw tightening, a muscle in his cheek twitching uncontrollably, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the defense table. By the time the clerk finished reading the unanimous guilty verdicts on all charges and special circumstances, Keith's composure had transformed into a rigid mask of barely contained emotion, though whether that emotion was rage, fear, or some combination remained difficult to discern. Judge Ramirez polled each juror individually to confirm their verdicts, a procedure that required each to verbally affirm their decision on each count, creating a powerful moment as 12 different voices consecutively declared Keith guilty of murdering his wife and daughters. Throughout this process, Keith stared straight ahead, his breathing becoming visibly more rapid with each confirmation, his attorney placing a cautionary hand on his arm as if sensing the internal struggle taking place beneath his client's increasingly fragile veneer of control. Eleanor Taylor closed her eyes briefly after the final juror confirmed the verdicts, her husband's arm around her shoulders as tears silently tracked down her face. Not tears of joy at the outcome, observers noted, but the release of emotion after months of maintaining strength through unimaginable grief and the ordeal of the trial process. The courtroom erupted into activity as soon as Judge Ramirez announced that the penalty phase of the trial would begin in 1 week, with prosecutors and defense attorneys immediately approaching the bench to discuss procedural matters while journalists rushed to file their stories. Deputies moved to escort Keith back to the holding cell, and it was at this moment that his composure finally shattered completely. Rising suddenly from his chair, Keith turned toward Eleanor Taylor with an expression of naked hatred, shouting, "Are you happy now? This changes nothing. They're still gone, and no verdict brings them back." Deputies quickly restrained him, but not before several spectators had captured video of the outburst on their phones, footage that would be played repeatedly on news broadcasts in the coming days as evidence of Keith's true nature breaking through his carefully constructed public persona. The contrast between his controlled performance throughout the trial and this raw moment of anger directed at his victim's family would become a defining image of the case in public memory. Outside the courthouse, Prosecutor Abigail Brown addressed the waiting media, her measured tone reflecting the solemnity of the occasion despite the successful outcome for her team. Today's verdicts represent a first step toward justice for Sophia, Lily, and Harper, Brown stated, flanked by Detective Mason Davis and other members of the prosecution team. While no legal proceeding can ever truly compensate for the loss of these 3 precious lives, we hope these unanimous guilty verdicts provide some measure of closure for the family and affirm that our justice system can hold accountable those who commit even the most heartbreaking crimes against the most vulnerable victims. Brown specifically acknowledged the pivotal role of the security footage in the case, noting that sometimes justice depends on the silent witness of a security camera capturing the truth when no human eyes are present to see it. This reference to the foundational evidence of Keith purchasing zip ties and bleach at 2:13 a.m. highlighted how this single piece of evidence had connected all other aspects of the case into a coherent narrative of premeditated murder. The jurors, escorted from the courthouse through a private exit to protect their privacy, later shared insights into their deliberation process through court-approved channels. According to these accounts, their discussions had focused heavily on the security footage as the starting point for evaluating all other evidence. Once we established that Keith had definitely purchased those items at that time, directly contradicting his initial statements about his whereabouts, everything else fell into place, Juror number 5 explained in an approved statement. The forensic evidence connecting those specific zip ties to the ones used on Sophia and Harper, the bleach residue matching what he purchased, the financial records showing his embezzlement, and Sophia's discovery of it, it all created a clear picture that couldn't reasonably be explained any other way. The jury had reportedly considered but ultimately rejected the defense's alternative suspect theory, finding it speculative and unsupported by physical evidence when compared to the multiple independent lines of evidence pointing to Keith's guilt. In the days following the verdict, public reaction reflected the widespread impact of the case, with discussions extending beyond the specifics of the crimes to broader issues of domestic violence, financial pressures in high-profile industries, and the psychology of family annihilators. Mental health professionals appeared on news programs to discuss the narcissistic personality traits evident in Keith's behavior before and after the murders, while financial experts analyzed the pressures and ethical challenges in entertainment industry financing that Keith had exploited in his embezzlement scheme. Domestic violence advocates pointed to the case as an extreme example of control and coercive behavior that often escalates to violence when the abuser's dominance is threatened, noting that Keith's murder of his family represented the ultimate act of control when his financial and public personas were at risk of exposure. For Eleanor Taylor and her family, the guilty verdicts brought a measure of legal closure but could never heal the profound loss they had suffered. In a brief statement released through their attorney, the Taylor family expressed gratitude for the jury's careful consideration of the evidence and the prosecution team's dedication to achieving justice, while requesting privacy as they continued to process their grief. Sophia, Lily, and Harper were the lights of our lives, the statement read. While we are grateful that the legal system has held their killer accountable, no verdict can fill the void left by their absence. We now ask for privacy as we honor their memories and learn to live in a world without their beautiful presence. This dignified response stood in stark contrast to Keith's courtroom outburst, reinforcing public sympathy for the victim's family and their restrained handling of an unimaginably painful situation thrust into the glaring spotlight of media attention. Kevin Keith was returned to the San Diego County Jail to await the penalty phase of his trial, during which the same jury would hear additional evidence and testimony before determining whether to recommend a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole or the death penalty. His defense team immediately announced plans to appeal the guilty verdicts, citing what they characterized as prejudicial pretrial publicity and questionable evidentiary rulings, though legal analysts generally assess these appeal grounds as standard procedure rather than substantive challenges likely to overturn the convictions. Keith himself reportedly refused to speak with his attorneys immediately after the verdicts, maintaining a stony silence as he was processed back into the jail's high-security unit, his prior status as a celebrated producer now permanently overshadowed by his new identity as a convicted family annihilator whose crimes had been proven beyond reasonable doubt by 12 unanimous jurors. The security footage that had formed the foundation of the prosecution's case, showing Keith purchasing zip ties and bleach at 2:13 a.m. on the night of the murders, continued to resonate as the defining image of the trial, the moment when his careful planning had been inadvertently captured and preserved, creating an irrefutable connection between the defendant and the implements later used to murder his family. As Detective Mason Davis remarked to his team after the verdicts were announced, Keith planned for almost every contingency: the murder methods, the cleanup, the alibi, the escape route, but he never planned for a security camera in that hardware store to capture him buying the tools he would use to kill his family. Sometimes justice hinges on the details that even the most careful criminal overlooks. This single piece of evidence, discovered through standard investigative procedure in the days following the murders had ultimately led to justice for 3 innocent victims whose lives had been cut short by the calculated actions of a man who had chosen to eliminate his family rather than face the consequences of his own financial crimes. The penalty phase of Kevin Keith's trial began on October 27, 2023, 1 week after the guilty verdicts, with the same jury now tasked with determining whether he would face life imprisonment without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. Unlike the main trial, which had focused on establishing Keith's guilt beyond reasonable doubt, this phase allowed both prosecution and defense to present evidence specifically related to sentencing considerations, including victim impact statements, potential mitigating circumstances from the defendant's background, and expert testimony about factors that might influence the appropriate punishment. The courtroom atmosphere had shifted subtly. The question of guilt now settled, the proceedings took on a more contemplative quality as jurors wrestled with the profound responsibility of potentially recommending that another human being be put to death, regardless of the heinous nature of his crimes. Judge Ramirez began with instructions emphasizing the gravity of this decision, reminding jurors that they were not merely extending their earlier verdict, but making an entirely new determination based on additional evidence and moral considerations beyond the facts of the crimes themselves. Prosecutor Abigail Brown opened the penalty phase with a measured address that acknowledged the weightiness of the decision facing the jury, while emphasizing the particularly calculated and cruel nature of Keith's actions. Kevin Keith didn't just commit murder. He betrayed the 3 people who trusted him most in this world, Brown stated, her voice carrying through the hushed courtroom. He looked into the eyes of his 5-year-old daughter as she tried to flee, stabbing her 17 times. He secured a plastic bag around his 2-year-old daughter's head with a zip tie, watching as she suffocated. He strangled the woman who had shared his life and built a family with him, all to protect himself from the consequences of his own financial crimes. Brown referenced California's legal requirements for the death penalty, noting that Keith's crimes met multiple special circumstances, including multiple victims, murder for financial gain, and murder to eliminate witnesses, any one of which qualified him for capital punishment under state law. The victim impact statements presented during this phase provided the most emotionally powerful testimony of the entire case, giving voice to the ongoing suffering caused by Keith's actions and humanizing the victims beyond the clinical evidence of the main trial. Eleanor Taylor, Sophia's mother, spoke first, holding a framed family photograph as she addressed the court in a voice that trembled but never broke. "When Kevin killed my daughter and granddaughters, he didn't just take 3 lives, he shattered dozens more," she testified, describing how holiday gatherings now fell silent, where once they had been filled with children's laughter. How she still found herself reaching for the phone to call Sophia before remembering she was gone, how she had kept the Mother's Day card Lily had been making, unfinished, in a special box that she couldn't bear to open, but couldn't bear to part with either. "There is a hollow space in our family now, a void that can never be filled, an absence that we carry with us through every day that remains of our lives." Michael Taylor, Sophia's father, spoke of the practical impacts of the murders, describing how he and Eleanor had been thrust into grief while simultaneously having to manage the legal aftermath of 3 deaths, arrange funerals, close accounts, and handle media inquiries. While we were still numb with shock, unable to process that our daughter and granddaughters were gone, we had to identify bodies, select caskets, choose burial plots, decisions no parent or grandparent should ever have to make, he testified, his weathered face showing the strain of months of unimaginable stress. Most devastating was his description of packing up the children's rooms in the weeks after the murders, putting Lily's stuffed animals and Harper's baby blankets into storage boxes, knowing they would never again be held by the little girls who loved them. There are no words for that kind of pain. Throughout these statements, Kevin Keith sat motionless at the defense table, his eyes fixed on a legal pad before him, refusing to look at the family members whose lives he had irrevocably altered. Sophia's sister, Rachel Taylor, provided insight into the unique relationship the sisters had shared and the devastating impact of knowing that Sophia had discovered her husband's crimes, but had been murdered before she could fully act on that knowledge. "Sophia called me the night before she died," Rachel testified, her voice breaking. "She told me she had found evidence that Kevin was stealing money, and she was going to confront him with what she knew. I begged her to wait, to talk to a lawyer first, to meet him in a public place, if she insisted on confronting him immediately." Rachel paused, visibly struggling with the weight of this final conversation. Her last words to me were, "Don't worry, he wouldn't dare hurt me. He cares too much about his public image." That's the part I can't forgive myself for, not recognizing that his image was exactly what he would kill to protect. This testimony underscored the calculated nature of Keith's crimes, providing additional context for his motive and highlighting how Sophia's trust in her husband's concern for appearances had tragically led her to underestimate the danger she faced. The defense team, led by attorney Jeffrey Bernstein, faced the challenging task of presenting mitigating factors that might persuade the jury to recommend life imprisonment rather than death, despite the unanimous guilty verdict. Their strategy centered on humanizing Keith through testimony about his childhood experiences, professional accomplishments, and mental health challenges. Dr. Lawrence Klein, a forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Keith after his conviction, testified about narcissistic personality traits that, while not rising to the level of legal insanity, had significantly impaired his ability to respond appropriately to threats to his self-image and perceived status. Klein described Keith's childhood with emotionally absent parents who valued achievement and appearances above all else, creating a psychological framework in which maintaining his successful image became, literally, a matter of life or death in Keith's distorted worldview. Several former colleagues testified to Keith's creative contributions to the entertainment industry and his mentorship of young filmmakers early in his career, before financial pressures and ego had led him down the path of embezzlement and eventually murder. These witnesses walked a careful line, acknowledging the horrible nature of his crimes while attempting to present a more complex picture of the defendant than had emerged during the main trial. The Kevin Keith who committed these unforgivable acts is not the same person I worked with for 15 years, testified Aaron Goldstein, a veteran producer who had collaborated with Keith on several successful projects. "I'm not excusing what he did. There can be no excuse for taking those lives, but I want the court to know there was more to him than just these terrible final actions." Throughout this testimony, Keith maintained the same impassive expression he had shown during the victim impact statements, offering no visible reaction to either the condemnation or the attempts at humanizing him. The most controversial moment of the penalty phase came when Keith himself chose to address the court. Against the explicit advice of his defense team, rising from his seat with a deliberate smoothness that suggested rehearsal, Keith faced the jury directly for the first time since the trial began. "I stand before you a convicted man," he began, his voice steady and devoid of the emotional tremor that might be expected in such circumstances. "The jury has found me guilty, and while I maintain my innocence, I accept that this is now the legal reality." This opening, neither a full admission of guilt nor an expression of remorse for the deaths themselves, set the tone for what observers would later describe as the most self-damning allocution in recent legal memory, a statement that appeared designed to express contrition, but instead revealed the narcissistic personality traits that had been discussed in expert testimony. Rather than directly addressing the suffering of the victims or their family, Keith spoke primarily about his own journey, describing his career achievements, the pressure he had faced in a competitive industry, and the financial challenges that had led to what he euphemistically called accounting irregularities. When he finally mentioned Sophia, Lily, and Harper, it was in the context of what he had lost, rather than what he had taken from them. "I think about them every day," he stated, his voice finally showing emotion that several jurors later described as appearing performative rather than genuine. "I think about the life we should have had together, the future that was stolen from all of us." This phrasing, casting himself as a fellow victim of circumstances rather than the perpetrator who had deliberately ended 3 lives, struck many in the courtroom as revelatory of Keith's fundamental inability to truly comprehend the moral magnitude of his actions or experience authentic remorse for anyone's suffering but his own. The final moments of Keith's statement veered into territory that would ultimately prove decisive in the jury's sentencing recommendation. Turning from the jury to face Judge Ramirez directly, Keith's tone shifted from rehearsed contrition to barely contained anger as he addressed the court. "This entire process has been a rush to judgment fueled by media speculation and the public's appetite for scapegoating successful men," he declared, his voice rising as his carefully maintained composure began to crack. "If this court imposes the ultimate penalty based on circumstantial evidence and emotional appeals rather than objective facts, you'll be making a decision you'll regret for the rest of your life." This statement, interpreted by prosecutors as a thinly veiled threat against the judge, caused an audible reaction in the courtroom and prompted Keith's attorney to place a restraining hand on his arm, which Keith angrily shook off before concluding with the words, "History will vindicate me, even if this court does not." Judge Ramirez, maintaining the impassive demeanor that had characterized his handling of the entire trial, simply thanked Keith for his statement and instructed the jury not to give it any special weight compared to other testimony they had heard during the penalty phase. Behind this judicial neutrality, however, courthouse sources later revealed that security had been immediately enhanced around the judge and his family following Keith's statement, with additional measures implemented to screen all communications to the court for potential threats. The impact of Keith's allocution on the jury was immediately apparent in their expressions. Several visibly recoiled during his apparent threat to the judge, while others exchanged glances that suggested Keith had inadvertently provided a live demonstration of exactly the narcissistic traits and capacity for intimidation that expert witnesses had described as factors in his crimes. After 3 days of penalty phase testimony, the jury retired to deliberate on their sentencing recommendation on October 30th, 2023. Unlike their guilt phase deliberations, which had concluded surprisingly quickly, this decision process extended across 2 full days as the jurors grappled with the moral weight of potentially recommending death for another human being. According to accounts later shared by jurors through approved channels, the discussions were emotionally intense but respectful, with each juror deeply conscious of the gravity of their responsibility. "This wasn't about whether Keith deserved to die for what he did," Juror Fester 8 explained in a post-trial interview. "It was about whether we as a society should take his life as punishment and whether that would serve justice for Sophia, Lily, and Harper in a way that lifetime imprisonment would not." When the jury returned to the courtroom on November 1st to deliver their recommendation, the tension was palpable. Kevin Keith, perhaps sensing that this represented his final moment in the public spotlight, had dressed with particular care in a tailored suit that evoked his former status as a successful producer rather than his current reality as a convicted murderer. The jury foreperson, still juror number 2, handed the sealed recommendation to the clerk, who passed it to Judge Ramirez for review before it was read aloud. As to count 1, the murder of Sophia Keith, we the jury recommend a sentence of death, the clerk announced, her voice steady but quiet in the hushed courtroom. As to count 2, the murder of Lily Keith, we the jury recommend a sentence of death. As to count 3, the murder of Harper Keith, we the jury recommend a sentence of death. With each pronouncement, Keith's expression hardened further, the mask of composure he had maintained throughout most of the trial finally crumbling completely to reveal the rage beneath. The formal sentencing hearing took place on December 15, 2023, following the preparation of pre-sentencing reports and the resolution of various procedural motions filed by the defense. The courtroom was once again filled to capacity with additional security measures in place following Keith's apparent threat to Judge Ramirez during his penalty phase statement. Eleanor Taylor and her family occupied the same front row seats they had maintained throughout the trial, their presence a quiet testament to the lives lost and the justice they sought. Keith, now visibly thinner and grayer than at the beginning of proceedings, entered the courtroom with the shuffling gait of a man who had finally begun to accept the reality of his circumstances, though observers noted that his eyes still held the calculating quality that had been evident throughout the case. Judge Ramirez delivered his sentencing decision with the careful precision that had characterized his handling of the entire trial, reviewing the jury's recommendations and his own assessment of the aggravating and mitigating factors presented during both phases of the trial. The crimes committed by the defendant represent the most profound betrayal imaginable, the deliberate taking of lives by the very person most responsible for protecting them, Ramirez stated, his voice grave but controlled. The evidence presented at trial established beyond any reasonable doubt that these murders were planned with cold calculation, motivated by the defendant's desire to silence his wife before she could expose his financial crimes, and executed with methods that demonstrated complete disregard for the humanity of the victims, including 2 innocent children. After methodically addressing each of the special circumstances found by the jury and acknowledging the limited mitigating factors presented by the defense, Judge Ramirez formally sentenced Kevin Keith to death for each of the 3 murders. It was at this moment that Keith, perhaps finally comprehending that all his careful planning, manipulation, and performance had ultimately failed to save him from the consequences of his actions, lost the last vestiges of his controlled facade. Rising suddenly from his chair, despite the restraining hand of his attorney, Keith turned toward Judge Ramirez with an expression of pure hatred. "You think this is justice?" he shouted, as deputies moved quickly to restrain him. "You'll regret this decision for the rest of your short life." This explicit threat, captured on courtroom cameras and witnessed by dozens of people, would later result in additional charges against Keith for threatening a judicial officer, though these became largely symbolic given the death sentences already imposed. The outburst provided a final unvarnished glimpse of the man behind the carefully constructed mask, not the grieving husband and father he had pretended to be, but the narcissistic killer who viewed others primarily as extensions of himself or obstacles to be eliminated. As Keith was led from the courtroom for the final time, his threat hanging in the air like a last desperate attempt to reassert control over a situation that had ultimately exposed and defeated him, Eleanor Taylor remained seated, her expression a complex mixture of grief, relief, and perhaps the first tentative steps toward closure. When approached by journalists outside the courthouse, she declined to comment on Keith's outburst or the sentences imposed, stating only, "Today was not about Kevin Keith. It was about Sophia, Lily, and Harper, and ensuring that their deaths were not forgotten or diminished. Justice has been served, but that doesn't bring them back. Nothing ever will." This dignified response, focusing on the victims rather than their killer, reflected the Taylor family's consistent approach throughout the ordeal, maintaining the humanity and individuality of their loved ones in the face of a legal process that necessarily focused on the clinical details of how those lives had ended. In the months and years following the sentencing, the case of Kevin Keith became the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and academic studies examining the intersection of narcissistic personality traits, financial pressure, and family annihilation. The security footage showing Keith purchasing zip ties and bleach at 2:13 a.m., the foundational evidence that had connected him directly to the murders, became one of the most recognizable pieces of crime scene evidence in recent memory, regularly featured in criminology textbooks as an example of how seemingly minor investigative steps, requesting security camera footage from nearby businesses, can yield crucial evidence. Law enforcement agencies across the country developed training programs based on the case, emphasizing the importance of thorough canvass procedures and the potential value of commercial security footage in establishing timelines and connecting suspects to crime scenes. The financial aspects of the case led to regulatory changes in the entertainment industry, with several major studios and streaming platforms implementing enhanced oversight procedures for production budgets and more transparent accountability for fund disbursements. The Keith Protocols, as these measures became known, established multi-level approval requirements for vendor payments above certain thresholds and regular external audits of production company finances designed to prevent the kind of systematic embezzlement that Kevin Keith had conducted through shell companies and fictional vendors. Industry experts noted that while no financial regulations could prevent crimes of passion, these enhanced protections might reduce the financial pressures and opportunities for fraud that had contributed to Keith's motive for eliminating his family. For the community of La Jolla and the broader San Diego area, the Keith case represented a profound violation of the sense of safety and privilege that had characterized the affluent coastal enclave. Property values in the neighborhood temporarily declined in the immediate aftermath of the murders, with the Keith mansion remaining unsold for nearly 2 years despite multiple price reductions, potential buyers unable to separate the property from the horrific events that had occurred within its walls. When the home eventually sold at a significant discount to an investment group, it was immediately demolished and replaced with a completely new structure, an attempt to literally rebuild over the physical location of the tragedy. Community healing took other forms as well. Lily's kindergarten class planted a memorial garden at La Jolla Country Day School, while the commercial production company where Sophia had worked established a scholarship for women directors in her name. Kevin Keith's case entered the lengthy appeals process that characterizes all death penalty cases in California, with his attorneys filing the first of many anticipated appeals in early 2024. Legal experts predicted the appeals would likely continue for a decade or more, regardless of merit, given the systematic review required in capital cases. Keith himself was transferred to San Quentin State Prison's death row, joining over 700 other condemned inmates in a state that had not actually executed anyone since 2006 due to ongoing legal challenges to its execution protocols. This reality, that Keith might well die of natural causes before any execution took place, added a complex layer to the justice experienced by the victim's family, who expressed their primary concern as ensuring Keith would never have the opportunity to harm others rather than specifically seeing him executed. Eleanor and Michael Taylor, with the support of their surviving daughter Rachel, established the Sophia, Lily, and Harper Foundation in 2024, dedicated to supporting children who have lost parents to domestic violence and advocating for enhanced recognition of financial control and manipulation as warning signs of potentially escalating abuse. "We couldn't save our daughter and granddaughters," Eleanor explained at the Foundation's launch event, "but perhaps their story can help save others by highlighting how financial crimes and controlling behaviors can escalate to violence when the abuser feels threatened. The foundation worked with domestic violence organizations to develop training materials helping financial advisors, accountants, and banking professionals recognize and appropriately respond to potential warning signs of financial abuse that might precede physical violence, creating a lasting legacy that transformed personal tragedy into societal benefit. The most profound legacy of the case, however, remained deeply personal. The absence of 3 lives cut short, and the ripple effects of that loss across families, friendships, and communities. Sophia Keith would never direct her planned feature film, never see her daughters grow up, never fulfill the professional promise she had shown in her commercial work. Lily Keith would never complete the Mother's Day card found in her craft drawer, never attend her first day of first grade, never develop the artistic and mathematical talents her teachers had identified. Harper Keith would never celebrate her 3rd birthday, never form complete sentences or memories, never discover her own unique gifts and interests. These absences, the unlived potential of 3 individual lives, represented the true cost of Kevin Keith's crimes, a cost that no verdict or sentence, however just, could ever fully address or redress. As Detective Mason Davis reflected in his final case notes, later published with permission in a criminology journal, the security footage showing Keith purchasing zip ties and bleach at 2:13 a.m. ultimately led to justice being served in legal terms. But true justice, the kind that would restore Sophia, Lily, and Harper to their family and their futures, remains forever beyond reach. In homicide investigation, we measure success by convictions secured and sentences imposed, knowing all the while that even perfect legal outcomes cannot heal the fundamental wound inflicted by the taking of a human life. The Keith case represents both our greatest success as investigators and our greatest limitation as a justice system. We caught, convicted, and condemned the killer, but we could not restore what he took. That reality haunts every homicide detective long after the case files are closed.